Great. Thank you all for coming. My name is Maciej Perkoski. I'm Senior Director at the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict, and I will be the moderator of the today's panel discussion that will follow the presentation from the main authors. And I would now like to introduce two speakers that join us here. And I will first start from Evan Perkoski, who is the lead author of the special report. Evan is Assistant Professor of Political Science at the University of Connecticut. He is specializing in the study of terrorism, insurgency, and violent and nonviolent uprisings. Using quantitative tools and original data, his research seeks to understand variations in the behavior of militant groups and the dynamics of internal conflict. He's particularly interested in the organizational dynamics of non-state actors, government responses to violent and nonviolent uprisings, cyber warfare, and the role of technology in subnational conflict. He has forthcoming publications on these topics in the Journals of International Organization and Journal of Conflict Resolution. And Evan previously held fellowships at Korbel School of International Studies at the University of Denver, as well as at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs of Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. He received his PhD and MA from University of Pennsylvania and a BA from Wesleyan University. So thank you, Evan, for being here with us. Thank you also for your patience during the process of writing with us your and Erica's excellent report. Now, the second author of the special report is most likely known to many of you. It's Erica Chenoweth. I have known Erica for almost 9 years. That has been quite a long time. And so firsthand, how her research has shaped and reshaped both civil resistance scholarship and civil resistance practice. Her quantitative research on nonviolent movements, even if based on sophisticated data analysis, remains very accessible to a general audience, general public, something that probably we cannot say of many academic studies. And consequently, her continued research provides extremely valuable and relevant information and findings for activists, international practitioners, as well as educators in the field of civil resistance. Erica is Professor and Associate Dean for Research at the Joseph Korbel School of International Studies at the University of Denver. She was ranked among the top 100 global thinkers by Foreign Policy magazine in 2013 for her efforts to promote the empirical study of civil resistance. Erica also received the 2014 Karl Deutsch Award from the International Studies Association for the scholar under age 40 who has made the greatest impact on the field of international politics and peace research. She's the author, together with Maria Stefan, of the groundbreaking book, Why Civil Resistance Works, The Strategic Logic of Nonviolent Conflict, that was supported by ICNC and published by Columbia University Press in 2011. That book won 2012 Woodrow Wilson Foundation Award given annually by the American Political Science Association in recognition of the best book on government, politics, and international affairs published in the US in the preceding calendar year. Erica, together with Maria Stefan, won 2013 Grawemeyer Award, which is an equivalent of the Nobel Prize in academia in the United States, for ideas improving world order, which is presented annually in recognition of outstanding proposals for creating a more just and peaceful world order. So a lot of recognition. She's also a prolific writer and speaker, and her commentaries are featured in various national and international media outlets. She's also recognized authority on political violence, in addition to her impressive contribution to the field of civil resistance. Erica received her MA and PhD in political science from the University of Colorado and BA in political science and German from the University of Dayton. Thank you, Erica, for being here with us. So now I will ask Erica and Evan to present the main key findings and recommendations from the special report. I will then ask our two discussants and as well as speakers to come to the stage, and I will introduce then discussants, and we'll hear then their comments on the report, and eventually we'll engage with every one of you here with your questions and then answers from the speakers as well.
Good afternoon, and let me add my thanks to you for spending time with us this afternoon to talk about this topic. Evan and I very much look forward to a thorough discussion and hopefully some feedback, both practical and kind of intellectual, as we proceed with this research program. I also want to thank ICNC for supporting the special report, the writing of it, the production of it, and the research in some small part as well. So to get us started, I'll just tell you about how this project originated. Evan and I were collaborating back in 2013, 2012, around the question of how we could better forecast and create signals for early warning surrounding this question of mass atrocity. And this was, of course, very much on the minds of perhaps many of you who were involved in US government initiatives on that topic at the time. There were, of course, the Atrocities Prevention Board and many other different organizational groups that were trying to understand what instruments were available for the prevention of mass atrocities, what early warning signals were available, and what social science insights might actually yield some practical strategies for reducing or responding to these events effectively. And for our part, we are involved in certainly the academic literature on this, which at the time really focused on a couple of key insights. One is that there are certain types of governments that are more likely than others, certain types of societies that are more likely than others to experience mass killings, usually defined by a fairly arbitrary measure of 1,000 unarmed people that are killed in a one-sided way by their governments or agents of their governments. Literature on that topic was informed by work by the Political Instability Task Force, Ben Valentino, Scott Strauss, many other people involved in that, that research domain. And so really they focused on the types of states, authoritarian regimes, states in which there was a high degree of discrimination, poverty, and the like as being most at risk for perpetrating mass killings. But the other thing that came out of the literature is this insight that armed dissent, that is the onset of civil war, guerrilla insurrectionary violence, predisposes a government to actually crack down using a mass atrocity as a way to basically force civilians to remain loyal to the government or pay the ultimate price. Now, those two insights really dominate the literature, and it is clear that there has been quite a bit of variation in the ongoing mass killings that have been perpetrated over time. And so when we see variation, we know that there are different factors that can explain the rise and fall of this phenomenon. And one of the assumptions in the literature, of course, is that in authoritarian regimes, there's basically only one way to dissent. Armed dissent is the only way that different groups can try to redress their grievances and bring about revolutionary change. But there is also a really important trend that kind of corresponds to the trends that we looked at in the sort of rise and decline of mass killings. And that's the rise and decline in armed internal conflict in general, corresponding with the rise of the use of nonviolent civil resistance as the primary mode by which people are now trying to redress their grievances. There is, of course, variation in the onset of nonviolent resistance and in the outcomes of it. And when I say nonviolent resistance, what I mean is a method of conflict where unarmed people resort to a series of methods like strikes, boycotts, protests, stayaways, and a certain coordinated sequence in order to directly confront an oppressive opponent and try to bring about change. The cases that we're looking at here in this slide are actually cases where there are three types of what we would call maximalist claims. So where they actually are trying to overthrow an incumbent national leader through irregular or extra-constitutional means, where they are trying to create an independent country because they're trying to kick out a foreign colonial power or occupier, or they're trying to secede. And we compare these maximalist campaigns because in much of the literature, they're assumed to be, first of all, the most difficult types of contexts where people are the most vulnerable to large-scale violence by their governments because it's very threatening. that systemic change that takes place as a result of the success of such movements. But the second reason is because many people assume that if your demands are radical and revolutionary, that your methods are also radical and revolutionary in the sense of using armed insurrectionary violence. So what we can see here is that while that was a fair assumption to make in the up until about the early 1980s, there has been a shift, and now the modal category of contention around the world, even in these maximalist domains, is the use of nonviolent resistance. Another thing that Evan and I observed early on in this project is that there is a correlation between the method of resistance being used and the incidence of a mass killing as it's defined by many scholars. In particular, violent campaigns, as is drawn out in the literature, are quite definitely at risk for mass killings as a response by the government. But nonviolent campaigns are far less likely to experience mass killings. Now, for those of you who understand that correlation is not necessarily causation, we could derive a number of different explanations for this, regularity. But Evan and I actually think that there might be things about nonviolent resistance campaigns that actually make this more of a causal relationship. The first thing is that we know that nonviolent resistance campaigns tend to inhere their power by drawing on local bases of support, meaning that they tend to be generally domestic affairs in which people are drawing their support and legitimacy from one another, from the fact that they grow very large and they rely primarily on people power as the main point of leverage. The second thing is that they tend to elicit, through large-scale mobilization, defections by security forces. And security forces are often the ones who are either going to be ordered to carry out mass killings or not if the incumbent leader thinks that they might defect if the order is given. And then the third thing is that nonviolent campaigns are probably more likely to be associated with the abandonment by the opponent regime by some of its international patrons. So for example, in the people power movement in the Philippines, it was easier for the Reagan administration to tell Marcos that they were on their own because they were facing a large-scale, nonviolent mass movement that was largely symbolized by nuns. That might not have been the case. Reagan might not have been so quick to throw Marcos under the bus if they were only facing an extended armed insurrection in urban areas. And so the way that we're sort of motivating this special report, and then I'll hand it over to Evan to take forward from here, is first of all the question of, can we isolate different factors of the campaigns rather than just the states that they're opposing that can help us to understand why some uprisings are facing mass killings, whereas others are not. And then in terms of nonviolent dissent itself, we know that in some cases there are mass killings against nonviolent dissidents. So the question is, when does that happen? And how can the use of unarmed dissent actually be made more safe than the use of nothing at all or armed dissent? So I'll pass it over to Evan now to discuss the research strategy and core findings.
Great, so I'm going to start off by talking about the research methodology we use to analyze these questions and find answers to why governments crack down on certain uprisings, then how we can use these findings to understand how protesters and others involved in these campaigns can remain safe. And to do this, we basically conducted a statistical analysis of all these major violent and nonviolent uprisings from 1945 to 2013. This comes from the Major Episodes of Contention project that has these large-scale, sustained, coordinated movements to either overthrow regimes or secede or force out a colonial occupier. We have these from 1945 to 2013 for both nonviolent and violent tactics being used in the campaigns. And we merged this with lots of other data on, first of all, mass killing, so when and where these government-led killings of civilians take place, and also with lots of other factors that might influence the rates of mass killings. Things about the country in particular, so regime type, levels of poverty and inequality, and things that might matter to these relationships. We then analyzed all this data for about 160 countries from 1945 to 2013 using a method called out-of-sample validation. And this relies on forecasting and prediction to basically understand how good of a job we're doing at modeling some phenomena. So in this case, mass killings. And the idea behind out-of-sample forecasting is really quite intuitive when you think about it. And so basically what we did was we took our data from 1945 to 2013. And that's once again on mass killings and on these violent and nonviolent uprisings. We then take this data and we divide it into two parts. So we divided the older data from 1945 to roughly the year 2000, and this most recent data on uprisings and mass killings and country characteristics from roughly 2000 to 2013. And what we do is we run lots of analyses and derive models, so models of why mass killings are taking place on this older data. We then use those analyses to generate predictions about what we think should be happening in this post-2000 time period. We used the older data to generate predictions about when and where mass killings should occur post-2000. The nice thing about that is that it gives us a nice test of how good of a job we're doing at predicting these events. So it moves us away from kind of basic traditional correlational analysis and really tells us how good of a job are we doing at predicting the most recent cases of mass killings. And so using this method, we kind of separate our analysis into country level and campaign level factors to understand which ones are driving rates of mass killings, where and when they take place. And as Erica mentioned, a lot of the existing literature focuses on these country level factors, regime type, inequality, so we already know a lot about that. And what's novel about our research is adding to that these campaign level factors. So factors related to the uprisings themselves. So how many people are involved? What are they trying to achieve? Are they using violent or nonviolent tactics? And that's really the innovative part of this study. In terms of the country level factors, we find that our results basically confirm the existing research on this question, that we find that certain things at the country level do impact when and where these governments resort to mass killings. In particular, we find a few things stand out. The first one is that regime type really matters, as you might expect. So military and single party-based regimes tend to be at the greatest likelihood of using this overwhelming force against their civilians. There are a few explanations why this might be the case. As you can imagine, military governments have pretty strong control over their military. And if they're worried about defections, if they order a mass killing, they might have a decreased fear of that taking place. Party-based regimes, once again, are more likely to use mass killings against an uprising, possibly because the incentives to remain in power are pretty high. Right? If the government is built around you and your party, you have a really strong incentive to maintain that system and maintain those benefits. So you might fight really hard to defeat the uprising and even resort to a mass killing. We also find at the country level that other factors matter, like the leader's tenure and the number of recent coups. So if the leader has been in power for a longer period of time, once again, that leader is more likely to resort to mass killings, because entrenched leaders have really strong reasons to remain in power. And recent coups have the opposite effect, that if there was a coup in the last 3 to 5 years, countries tend to be at a much lower risk of a mass killing. And once again, we think this is related to the idea of defections, that if you can't trust your military, you might be more hesitant to use them against an uprising to kill civilians if you think they might overthrow you. And as with most literature on political violence and on instability, we find that population size is positively correlated with mass killings. Countries with more people tend to be at a greater likelihood of experiencing terrorism, civil war, and also extends to mass killings in the context of these popular uprisings. And similarly, we also find that when part of that population is institutionally discriminated against, politically and economically and socially, that is also a precursor to mass killings. That if you have institutionalized discrimination, you might also experience institutionalized violence later on during these campaigns. And finally, one of the best predictors of mass killings we found in the course of these uprisings is whether or not a state committed a mass killing recently in the last 5 years. Once again, there are a few reasons why this makes sense. It could be that these states committed a mass killing. They know they have the infrastructure and the experience, and they also know they can trust their military agents. They've tried it before, no one defected, they can therefore use it again against a future uprising. As I mentioned, the most novel thing about our research is that these characteristics of campaigns also influence regime elites' decisions to utilize force against their own civilians. And one of our biggest findings from this research is that the method of contention really does matter. we find that violent conflicts, violent uprisings against the state for these maximalist claims tend to experience a much greater likelihood of mass killings. So if you use violence against the state to try to overthrow it, there's a stronger likelihood the state will resort to violence against those in the uprising. Conversely, when campaigns are using nonviolent resistance tactics, like those that Erica mentioned, including sit-ins and stayaways and boycotts, those tend to be at a much lower risk of receiving that state retribution in terms of violence. This is especially likely when that nonviolent campaign can get defections from the armed forces. In the case where you have a nonviolent movement that also can gain military defections, that campaign is an 88% lower risk of being met with a mass killing. And that has a significant effect on the chance that these civilians are met with deadly, lethal force. We also find the goals and whether or not there's foreign support for the movement also matters. So in terms of the 3 goals that are included among the campaigns in the major episodes of contention data, including anti-colonial, kind of pushing out foreign occupiers, secession, and regime overthrow, those trying to change the incumbent regime, not surprisingly, are at the greatest risk of that government-led violence. And finally, one of the more interesting findings from this research is that foreign state support to that campaign, to that uprising, be it violent or nonviolent, is correlated with a much greater chance of a mass killing. That when foreign states are intervening, given direct material or economic assistance to that movement, the likelihood of mass killings goes up significantly. And there are a few reasons why that might be, right? So in these campaigns, when you have a foreign state giving direct support, it might make that movement seem a lot more threatening. That binds regime elites and their military agents together in terms of this unified threat they're facing from abroad. And in that case, the regime elites can order mass killings and not be worried about defection. Also in that case, you might expect that those who are thinking about defecting might not do it if a foreign military is involved. They might be more hesitant to join their forces compared to if that was a grassroots movement of their fellow citizens. So using this method of out-of-sample forecasting, we're able to test each variable for how much predictive power it gives us. And this is ranking these different variables. And it basically says, if you were only given one variable, which one gives you the best insight into when and where mass killings will occur? We rank these, so recent mass killings have the strongest effect, give us the most predictive power, going down to number 10, so whether or not there are multiple concurrent resistance campaigns taking place in the state. As you can see from this, there's a mix of these campaign and country level factors. It's not just about the country, but what the campaign is doing and what foreign actors are doing also has a significant effect. So as I mentioned, the recent mass killings at the top, followed by the regime type, but then right there is the external support to that uprising and to that campaign. And that significantly increases the odds of mass killings and gives us really great predictive leverage over when and where they might occur. Then we see their goals matter, so once again, another campaign level factor, followed by population, that perennial significant finding in political violence research, coup attempts, another regime type variable, subgroup discrimination, and once again, 2 things related to the uprising. If it's a nonviolent campaign that can get military defections, once again, a much lower risk of violence. And if there are multiple concurrent resistance campaigns, the odds once again go up. That might increase the threat to the regime, forcing them to double down and use violence. So overall, what are the implications of our research for policymakers, practitioners, and activists? And what can they do utilizing this information? There are a few very tangible things. So the first one is for activists, we find that maintaining nonviolent discipline is key. Avoiding violence is absolutely critical. Don't use violence against the regime because that forces them to use violence in response. And that creates a cycle where more and more people are simply killed. The second thing we find is that encouraging military defections is critical. Separating the regime elites and the leaders from their armed forces can cause them to rethink using mass violence in the first place, or if they ultimately order it, their military forces might not follow through, and the mass killing might not take place. And there are lots of ways people can do this. From the activist perspective, maintaining that nonviolent discipline is key. Highlighting your shared bonds and connections with the armed forces can also help make it seem like they can defect and be safe. But from the foreign perspective, states can also do things to encourage and help relocate families of military members who defect, providing money to help them relocate and leave the country if they fear for their safety, ultimately making it easier for military agents to leave the regime. In terms of this external support, We find that because foreign state support is positively associated with mass killings, states should be very weary of providing this direct economic or material assistance. This should really only happen in cases where there's a direct critical need for some type of assistance, and instead states should think about things that are less visible, that might make it seem less like they're meddling in a foreign state's affairs and less like that domestic uprising is more threatening. They can think about knowledge sharing, information sharing, capacity building, and training operations. All of that can help maintain nonviolent discipline, but avoid the negative costs that come with the direct intervention. In a long time, foreign states, activists, policymakers can think about addressing the structural causes of violence. Right? And these are causes of violence that not only relate to mass killings, but to civil war, terrorism, insurgency, and the underlying reasons causing these uprisings in the first place. So you can think about reducing inequality, reducing poverty and development programs, and basically supporting democracy and the peaceful turnover of power. So this in the long term addresses the roots of the uprisings and the roots of that underlying violence as well. All right, so thank you very much, and I look forward to discussion.
Hey, great. So I would like to introduce first our discussants and ask them for some comments, a couple of minutes, each of you, on the report. And then I will ask authors to respond, and then eventually we'll open the discussion to the audience to ask questions. So first of all, I wanted to introduce Victoria Holt, who is a distinguished fellow at Henry L. Stimson Center. Prior to joining Stimson, Victoria was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for International Security in the Bureau of International Organization Affairs at the U.S. Department of State, serving from 2009 to early 2017. In that role, she was responsible for U.S. policy and guidance for U.S. actions in the UN Security Council. She oversaw the Office of Peace Operations, Sanctions and Counterterrorism, and the Office of United Nations Political Affairs. She led the development of U.S. diplomatic initiatives, including the 2015 Leaders Summit on UN Peacekeeping hosted by President Obama. Victoria writes and speaks widely on the UN and regional peace operations, the protection of civilians and atrocity prevention, targeted sanctions, rule of law, and U.S. policymaking. She served on the Genocide Prevention Task Force and wrote a pioneering report on UN missions and the protection of civilians. During the Clinton administration, she served as a senior policy advisor in the Bureau of Legislative Affairs at the U.S. Department of State, and she also worked at Washington-based Policy Institute on International Affairs and Nuclear Weapons Issues. She's a graduate of the Naval War College and Wesleyan University. And yes, and I would like to, it's a pleasure, Victoria, to have you here, and I'm looking forward to your contribution and comments. And I would like to introduce the second panelist, Mohammed Abdul Shafi, who goes by Conde, and is a founding member of Darfur Students Movement against Darfur genocide. Because of his activism, Conde was forced by the Sudanese government to flee to East Africa, where he continued his work. In 2018, Conde received the Civil Society Leadership Award from the Open Society Foundation as a form of recognition for his activism and civic leadership in Sudan. Conde is currently an advocacy and research fellow at Peace Direct, where he conducts research and advocacy on Sudan. He holds dual masters in sustainable international development and coexistence and conflict resolution from Brandeis University. He holds a BA in development studies from Kampala International University in Uganda, as well as diploma in philosophy from the University of Khartoum, Sudan. So basically we'll have, I think, more policy perspective on the report from Victoria, and from Conde, more kind of activist take on some findings and recommendations based on that, on the report. So Victoria, please take the floor.
Well, thank you very much. So I do not have a PhD. I don't know how to do regressions. But what I wanted to really say after reading the report and getting a bit more of a briefing is how important this kind of research actually is long-term for policymakers and those trying to implement conflict prevention in the field. So I thought I would situate this kind of work briefly from a policy perspective, and then give some comments both on your findings, a couple questions, and then maybe a recommendation on the way forward. Where I want to situate is those of us in Washington are well aware. We go through cycles of problem sets, not just showing up in the media, but being front and center for members of government or NGOs or people in the field. Certainly coming out of the 90s and the 2000s, the question of mass atrocities was high on the mind of many people who had served in government, whether it was Rwandan genocide or what happened in the Balkans or dozens of other conflicts around the world. There really was a sense that how do you prevent mass atrocities and genocide was not a question that was easy to answer. As you mentioned, I was on the Genocide Prevention Task Force, which wrote a report roughly 10 years ago. It was before the presidential election. And that team, both the Republicans and Democrats, academics and government people, really looked hard at the US government structure and said, how well designed is this to anticipate, prevent, and respond to mass atrocities and genocide? And the rough answer was, lots of great people, lots of good intention, but there's no concerted center of gravity on this, from the analytics all the way through to accountability. So that was a really tough report, but it was a good one. And it was adopted much by the previous administration. And as I understand, the Trump administration is continuing this work to first set up analytics to say, what are the indicators of potential violence against civilians? And what are the ways of long-term conflict prevention? What are the ways to respond effectively both as a nation and in the multilateral community, including both the diplomatic, AID, and the military roles? And then finally, how does accountability help a cycle of non-reoccurrence? So the reason I link this in is if we look at new conflict sets that maybe Washington is more consumed with, we see the rise of the Arab Spring and the challenge to democracy movements, and then most recently, obviously, the role of extremists, proxy groups, and those who have no regard for international humanitarian human rights law as a certain challenge. A recent study by the World Bank and the UN pointed to these three areas as really difficult for conflict prevention. So that's all a scene setter to say we have to take seriously the analysis of what an escalation against civilians looks like and what those tactics are as part of a larger strategy to try and prevent it. So a few things I really appreciate out of this report. First, it seems obvious to all of us, but violence draws violence. So what I really take away from this report is how do you maximize the period of nonviolence resistance for most effect? It doesn't mean it will always work, and I think your findings don't show that it always works, but you show that on the whole it has a better shot than going immediately to violence. For policymakers, that's fabulous. How do you actually teach us how to see that and implement strategies to support that in the short and long run? Second, this report is very clear-eyed. If you think it's just a moralistic, we all should be nice to each other argument, it's not. It's about using a campaign-minded approach to understand tactics and results. And I think that's something often is missed in the community that's worrying about atrocities. It's often a choice on purpose by political actors to gain something they care about. When you crack down on civilians, there's a whole bunch of that. There's a whole bunch of attacks on civilians that is absolutely organized and purposeful. And all of those who work in government need to be mindful of that. I think third, it talks about the long-term structural analysis is often used to look at insecurity and potential atrocities, and they assess it's not useful alone. It can't just be a static assessment. It needs to be contextualized and understood on a timeline, and I would fully agree with that. And then finally, how to fill in tactics. Anyone who's worked in the US government's like going to meetings every half an hour, give me the brief, and now what do I do? You don't have time to get a PhD on the conflict you're looking at. So breaking down what you've seen across your data set's helpful. Okay, one more point about framework. You could also flip this around. A lot of international actors are responding to atrocities or potential harm to civilians. There's a huge movement on protection of civilians. It's been added to mandates for UN peace operations, African Union-led operations, and even NATO in Libya. If you start by saying, how do those operations prevent harm to civilians? There's often a real challenge to understand how to protect civilians. So I just want to point out one other framework, which starts with a question of categorizing violence. There's a Norwegian Defense Research Group, and they came up with 8 areas. And I mention it here because it might help our minds wrap around what are we talking about when it's violence against civilians. Obviously, the most severe is genocide, followed in no particular order by ethnic cleansing, government repression, communal violence, predatory violence, insurgency, post-conflict revenge, and mob violence. Sorry, that's a long list. I throw it out because if you look at the conflicts around the world and you look where civilians are coming under harm, those are the rough categories. So for the one on government repression, which is what you've focused on, some of the indicators you describe are quite obvious, that the government wants to hang on to power They see no alternative, and they will respond to violence with violence. And they will even try and create violence in the opposition to them as an excuse to respond. The international community has not come up with all the answers to this. My colleague who is here from Simpson pointed out it's even mandated in the Congo that the peacekeeping mission try and stop political violence. But I don't think they have a handbook yet to tell them how to do that. All right, so 3 challenges to you all, and then 1 policy question. Did you look in your research at outside factors? Whether or not it's not just material aid to the resistance, but whether the African Union or the UN applauded the opposition or called out the government for human rights abuses or condemned them. Were there sanctions imposed on the multilateral stage or any embrace of the protesters by the international media? My second question would be, is the protest alongside other conflict? We often see atrocities sometimes masked by other challenges. A breakdown in a peace agreement may go on alongside atrocities. Diplomats sometimes have to choose which they're going to look at. So is there a correlation between response, given what else is going around it? And third, I noticed your data set went up to 2013. But certainly the world has changed even in the last 3 or 4 years, and it seems that there's a really deep spike in civilian insecurity, not just IDPs, refugees, and economic migration, but also purposeful attacks against civilians by extremists, proxy groups, and others, and purposeful violence. I'm curious if that might shift any of your findings. And then finally, I would just say on policy grounds, it would be really terrific if there was some follow-on research to take the tactics you roughly sketch out and think about how those could be applied in the field, either for a government trying to do the best it can or the international community trying to work with balancing rightful, legal, democratic protests with governments fearing for their future. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Victoria. Thank you for the insightful comments and the tough questions. So, but before I will give the floor to the authors, let's hear from Conde, more kind of activist perspective on the report and its findings.
Thank you so much, and thank you for ICNC for organizing this, working very hard to make this happen, and thank you, Erica and Deb, for the great work on this research. It really gives empirical evidence of, do you get me? I think I need to raise my mic.
It's okay, it's working, okay. You just need to speak up maybe a bit. Yeah,
so thank you for this. This report really represents a momentum for me personally to have an empirical data that support the importance of the nonviolent movement as a tool for not only changing system, but also for citizens' peace building, where citizens are able to be actively participate. I just want to give some brief as in my experience and seeing the nonviolent movement in Sudan. In 1964, Sudan was one of the first countries to make a nonviolent movement and change the dictator regime. And it did again in 1984 and 85. What I want really to emphasize is that despite this timeline of your data shows the decrease in violent movement in 90s, Sudan, the timeline goes opposite way. And here there comes a question. I was trying to find a reason to answer, but I was seeing that the nonviolent movement itself needs the concept of citizenship to be enshrined from the people who are taking the nonviolent movement to try to organize themselves to do this. This in Sudan, for example, is a very big question where certain communities, regions have a very historic hostile relationship with the state as an institution since colonial time. And it is very difficult for people who feel so much vulnerable and see the state as so much oppressive and dangerous institution to peacefully go and stand and say, please change this. So even because of such perception, going to make a peaceful demonstration, it also gives such kind of legitimacy and connection that you people basically don't believe in it. As a result, that's why the conflict started in 1965 in South Sudan and went to Blue Nile, South Kordofan, Darfur. Particularly, these are the regions which historically have a hostile relationship. So I see that one of the preconditions for the existence of nonviolent movement itself, it needs that concept of citizenship, which enshrines on rights, that I have rights and duties on this state and demand those rights peacefully. And it needs to feel some certain level of peace, of security, that you are able to do that. And that might come the question, why in our generation, for instance, when I was in university in 2003, the conflict broke out and people went to war, and the whole region was destroyed for just a distance of 3 or 4 months when we were in school. And why the state's behavior in this group, particularly was this, is kind of collective punishment more than to be a reaction for armed resurrection. And this is really gives another indication on how people were it was more easy for some communities or some groups in the country to go to take arms. It's safer for them than really go to street and demonstrate and say, this is not right. When systems, regimes, and laws are really make it hard for that to happen. And why we did peaceful movement at the universities. And this also gave me another additional perspective that the increased access to education make it more possible for people to practice, even if there is no chance, the rights as the concept, as the citizenship. And it's more easy that building nonviolent movement, in my experience, is a process that really needs a very strong education and really need a civil or citizen negotiation. And if you don't have any free, small space to do that, it will be, even if you are successful to spark out or start the civil movement, it will be very challenging and difficult to make it sustainable. And this really shows why there is the nonviolent movement in Libya, Chad, in Libya and in Yemen and Syria was easily turned into violence because there was no pre-civil society institutions. There is no alternative institution. There is only states institutions. And then there is below that, there is either tribal ethnic groups or either religious sects. And because particularly in autocratic regime, the one thing that they do, because they are afraid of citizens, they make a police regime to protect and to prevent any alternative way of people having an affiliation and allegiance to other institutions than the government. And this policy regime might criminalize any collective action, freedom of expression, freedom of access to information, freedom of association, which are so much important in building successful nonviolent movement. And here I just want to comment into the one of the very important takeaway of defining the goal and objective of nonviolent movement as a very crucial element on the future success or failure of the movement. In Sudan experience, I was watching and really following up in recent demonstration, and I see more than 200 youth groups from different groups and different affiliations. They agreed together to meet in certain place to make a demonstration. And I will see they chant for the against the increased prices, and suddenly they stop. The other one will chant about for corruption, against the corruption, but the third chanting will go about we need to topple this government right now. And that means these are different types of demands. And these people are experiencing different level of oppression. People who feel that oil is so expensive, so I can't take my kids to school by my car. And people who are thinking that all their houses are destroyed and their families in IDP camp. Where you find the shared vision here and build it for these two different. So that is why this will say we need to topple this regime. That is the only solution. The others will say we can force the regime to open economy and make some kind of improvement. So there is no dialogue, and this dialogue to be formed needs some certain level of freedoms for these ideas to be built. And here comes the question of international intervention. I don't know how do you desegregate the data on international intervention. Do you see that as, for instance, in Sudan, like US sanction as a country, or you see that as a regional mechanism, for instance, African people on human rights as a mechanism where government of Sudan is part of it, for instance. How those, like when the AU, for instance, can force the government of Sudan, which it is part of the member, to accept and open the freedom. And that is also another way of intervention. If we see this way, there is less reaction on that. So I would think that how we alternatively channel not only financial support, not only technical or logistical support for nonviolent movement, but also how international community could use the regional and international mechanisms to fight the policy regimes and laws that makes impossible for this dialogue to happen in the societal level. So I am really so happy to read this report. It really gives more deep understanding on the dynamics and tactics, and it's something that really more need further research on contextual issues that are so much more relevant in different contexts. But I'm really happy to read and really happy to hear more from you guys. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Conde.
Thanks.
Great. I want to just build on 2 points, one from Conde and one from Victoria, to add to the mix of questions and comments that you received, then I will let you respond. Conde mentioned the importance of nonviolent discipline, particularly in a very severe kind of repressive environment. I mean, you mentioned it, how can you convince those activists to actually remain nonviolent if there is such a level of repression? And at the same time, you stress the importance of nonviolent discipline, you stress the importance of the security defections. That's another challenge, how to see basically allies of the regime as being possible interlocutor in order to bring them on your side with that level of repression. So maybe you could also reflect on possible strategies, both on the part of external actors as well as activists that could somehow help them to maintain nonviolent discipline that you advocate as a crucial element to reduce mass killings, as well as reach out to security forces to elicit defections. And building on what Victoria said about external actors, I was one external actor that I thought you could bring up, and I cannot criticize too much the report because I'm a serious editor and to illustrate very badly on me. So, but basically I wanted to ask you about the role of international organizations such as UN, because it reminds me of Fiji, and Fiji government is kind of very reluctant, even if it's not, it's autocratic government, is very reluctant to engage in any type of massive repression against civilians in order to maintain power. And some people were indicating that this is because they send quite a lot of their own troops to UN peacekeeping missions. And basically UN has indirect leverage on the government to kind of tame their behavior. So I wanted to kind of ask you if you can also extend the discussion about the role of external actors to bring international organizations, connect that possibly with the activists and the impact also on the governments and pressuring them and reducing the likelihood of mass killings.
Great. Well, thank you very much for the excellent comments and for engaging so carefully with the study. I'll start with a couple of them, and I might just kind of combine some answers to some of the questions that were related. So on this matter of other international actors or other international contexts that might bear on the politics of the conflict in question, the nature of the data design for this study doesn't really allow us to pull out the different players or the different types of interventions, other than fairly blunt metrics of whether there was state-based assistance to the opponent, the opposition, or whether there was the withdrawal of state-based assistance from the opponent, kind of in retaliation. But it's very blunt. It's a dichotomous measure of whether it happened or not, and it's only by state. So we didn't actually look at multilateral organizations or international organizations. We didn't look carefully at different gradations of sanctions that are possible and other factors that you all brought up. But I will mention that Maria Stefan from USIP and I are right in the midst of a data collection and analysis project where we're trying to collect more data about the different variety of external actors, including international organizations, but also transnational solidarity groups, different training organizations, legal assistance organizations, and other NGOs, media, and others. And we're looking at different types of assistance, that is material assistance, but also technical assistance, moral assistance, the provision of sanctuary, safe passage, and different ways of mitigating repression. And those data are under collection right now, supported by ICNC. And we hope to have some really basic findings about which types of support by which types of supporters seem to actually help the campaigns more than they hurt them in these different contexts. But as far as I know, there haven't really been any systematic studies that have looked at the question in exactly that way. It's very complex. But the kind of long story short answer is that we're working on it. In terms of your question about, are there preconditions in the society, levels of education, levels of kind of public norms around citizenships and citizenship and the enshrinement of rights? Are there kind of shared senses of solidarity or unity that can be drawn upon as bases of legitimacy? Evan and I have a longer-term study that's trying to understand whether there are kind of preconditions for the onsets of these movements. And by and large, it's kind of surprising that there aren't any really systematic factors that come out as appearing to be necessary. I mean, the cases that you brought up, Yemen, Libya versus Syria, I mean, even Syria is a very well-educated society, very high literacy rates, actually much lower levels of poverty than many other states in the region. There was a kind of a flurry of salons and intellectual conversation, a period of reform in the early 2000s. People called it the Damascus Spring in 2000, where people seemed to be able to convene very robust and actually quite critical conversations in the country that were calling for different types of reform. And those continued on and off throughout the next decade. And so, I think that actually it's less about whether there are preconditions per se and more about the fact that people seem to be content with mobilizing before organizing. And so with this question about how do you get nonviolent discipline in a context that's highly dangerous and people don't yet agree, that might be a case where the stakes are even higher to organize prior to mobilizing. That is to say, the consensus has to be built and led into being built before it's a good idea to do anything contentious, right? And that's true in the United States as it is in highly authoritarian contexts, I would say. So just this mindset of organizing before mobilizing, I think would be very important. And then also just helping people to separate from this notion that using nonviolent resistance is the same as using ordinary politics or political co-optation, right? It's not. It's dissent. It's a radical form of dissent. Radical because it's been, so often misused or underused until now. It's a technique that was really that has been with us since we've been writing history books, but that Gandhi popularized and people from the global South have been perfecting, and is now in its moment, right? And so it's the new thing. It's the radical form of political action. It's not political co-optation and just ordinary politics. And if people thought about it that way, they might be more willing to come along with the technique. Evan?
Yeah, I had a few things to this discussion. Thank you both for your comments. I think these are great, both in thinking about this current project and what we're doing, hopefully in the future. And just a couple points on this question of other types of international actors and the effects they might have. I think one of the really understudied dynamics is the role of diaspora communities and how they can impact foreign uprisings. And I think that's something that, on some other research I'm doing, I find that these signals diaspora communities send through support and through legitimacy they lend to uprisings can have a big impact on the cohesion of the incumbent regime. Now, typically when you see this diaspora support, it means a lot more to the uprising and to the government than some foreign actor who might have dubious intentions. So I think that's another thing to study is not just IOs and these formal institutions, but foreign communities of citizens. And it's a really interesting question of the preconditions for nonviolence to take place. And you brought up things like education and kinship ties and these other networks. But I think I would push back a bit and say that I think these are also necessary for effective violent movements to take place. That you need to recruit lots of people to really confront the state violently. You need to train people. It's not an easy thing to do. I think at lunch, you maybe brought up the quote, I can't remember from which country, but in South Africa, they liked when the ANC was using violent tactics because they didn't know how to shoot. They're much easier than if they were using nonviolent tactics, which anyone can engage in. So I think those kinship ties and all these kind of this infrastructure that might help an uprising is critical to both violence and nonviolence. But certainly studying that and looking more into that is going to be critical. And I think in terms of some of your other comments, unfortunately, and this is really a cop-out answer, but in many ways we're limited by what we have right now with data. And so Erica and Maria Stefan and others are doing really great stuff in collecting new, more granular data on the types of foreign actors that are supporting these uprisings, what they're doing, how they're getting involved, the types of organizations that are doing it, and even the organizations that are committing the violent acts. So in many cases, it's not just the state that is killing civilians in these conflicts, but you have non-state actors who are competing with other non-state groups and competing with the state to enforce loyalty and to gain the recruits, and they use violence very strategically as well, as you brought up, which is a great point. So I think one of the things we're trying to do is get more data to understand these things. And I think another really interesting question that is raised by our research findings and that Victoria also brought up is thinking about concurrent movements in a state. Right, so one of our top 10 predictive variables, and number 10, is whether or not you have concurrent movements in a state. And we don't disaggregate it in terms of whether or not it's two nonviolent movements or two violent movements, but we just find that whenever you have multiple of any type of uprisings, that poses a greater threat to the state, and the state is more likely to crack down. But absolutely, the dynamics will be different if it's two independent violent movements versus two independent nonviolent movements. But one point on that, I think the existing data does do a pretty good job of capturing whether or not the competing movements have the same goals or different goals. If they have the same goals, I think in the major episodes of contention data that we use, they might be categorized as a radical flank or a mixed strategy type of uprising. But definitely we need to do more on that because I think nowadays you are seeing a number of cases where you have multiple independent campaigns taking place, and that's going to shift the dynamic both of what the government does and how foreign actors should get involved.
Great. So I think we are ready to engage with the audience and collect your questions to the speakers as well as to the discussants. So
Hi, my name is Eli McCarthy. I'm at Georgetown University. Thank you so much for the research. I have a question about if you've looked into the role of the strategy of humanizing the adversary, and if that is a factor in mass killings occurring.
And I would like to collect a couple of more questions. And the lady in the...
Hi, my name is Madeline. I work with Tori at the Stimson Center. Thank you to the researchers and to the discussants. I want to ask a question about the one finding that seemed counterintuitive to me, which is this idea of military defections actually having a negative impact, partially because you're speaking to an audience that lives in a society that really values the apoliticization and the civilian-led security apparatus. And I wonder if there's a qualifier there to situations where the state doesn't have alternative security forces that it can rely on to outside the scope of of accountability, transparency measures to do its work. I'm thinking right now about in Burundi, right, in the military that was really not willing to go along with some of the human rights situations with the government because it didn't want to lose its seat in Amazon. And the state had a fallback option in the Imbonerakure to operate outside of the accountability measures that state security forces are. Anyway, there does seem to be a counterintuition to the idea that fostering the destabilization of security forces would have this kind of impact. So I'd love to hear more about your thoughts on the counterintuitiveness of that.
And here was my question in the first one.
My name is Nadia. First, I want to, a human rights advocate, I want to thank your institution for the education that you make available without any discrimination or affiliation. I wanted to I have a little comment on Syria. The Syrian case, there existed civil societies resisting, but they were like most of the other places in the region, violently repressed by the regimes. And I don't know, I want your expertise comment on this, if it's more related to foreign states intervention that conjured it from civil resistance into an armed conflict. Thank you.
Okay. And so on top of those questions, I will throw one of mine, which is about the campaign goals. You do mention that the probability of mass killings increase when the campaign goal is about removing the leadership, in comparison with the campaign goal that is about kind of seeking territorial gains. And but then you also speak about mass killings that were, or civilian victimizations that occurred in the kind of disputed territories. So it's a kind of territorial oriented dispute. So I was wondering, is there some kind of contradiction or not? And then maybe link that with what Conde was saying about different campaign goals, that how actually, if you were to have some certain recommendations for activists and organizers on the ground, based on your research, what then, if it's not about regime change, what other campaign goals might be more amenable to reduce the likelihood of mass killings, based on your research?
Sure, I'll start for this one because you did the last one. So thank you guys for the questions. Those are really interesting and very well informed. So Eli, your question on the strategy of humanizing the adversary. I'm curious, are you thinking about that in terms of the state or against the opposition, or if you'd expand on that a bit?
Well, I mean, you looked at violent campaigns and nonviolent campaigns, right? And tried to pull out factors that made mass killing more or less likely. Mm-hmm. So I'm just wondering if in those campaigns, if part of the strategy is to humanize the adversary, assuming it's a state repressive group, and that can be the rhetoric they use, it can be the types of other strategies they use or not use, but to message that the adversary still has dignity, even though they're going to do all they can to resist the injustice and the violence. Because not all nonviolent campaigns do that. So what do you think?
Yeah, it's a great point, and I think you do see divergent strategies for whether or not you're the opposition or the state. And the state will many times try to kind of dehumanize and delegitimize the movements that are seeking to overthrow them, either through rhetorical devices or by trying to conduct false flag operations like terrorist attacks that they attribute to this uprising that in reality is nonviolent. But you see this fake violent operation that they attribute to the uprising that gives them legitimacy to crack down and use violent tactics and therefore escalate the conflict. On the other side, I think you see the opposite strategy taking place with typically nonviolent resistance campaigns where you try to humanize both who you are and the regime. And you say to the security forces, you try to highlight your shared bonds, your shared community and history and citizenship and goals. And by doing that, you make them more likely to see you as people who are working for a better society and a better state, and not as an adversary seeking to overthrow the regime. And that can increase the odds that these defections take place. And that's kind of a well-known strategy of the political jiu-jitsu of nonviolent resistance campaigns.
Can I add just a comment on that? Mm-hmm. One of your recommendations, but something I saw when I worked in government, is when you have a leader who is oppressive, to open the door for them to do something else. And so there's a bit of a challenge if the international community has condemned a regime or a government or an individual or sanctioned them, at the same time knowing that there might be less violence if they would leave the country for a post or give some face-saving way for them to step down. This is also related to not just the individual leader, but the families who are often economically or the business partners benefiting from the regime. It's not related necessarily to the dynamics. So I think there is a corollary between long-term conflict prevention and not overly demonizing a leadership if indeed they are to be able to depart without violence.
And I'll just add one more point on the second question from Madeline about defections, and I'll let Erica take over. But I think our point about defections is not that states should be encouraging more politics in foreign militaries, but actually less politics. That you want to support human rights and democratic norms among foreign militaries. And the respect for human rights is something that is also ingrained in the US military. And ideally, what you want is not for them to follow orders when they simply don't want to, but faced with these orders to kill thousands of their own civilians, they rethink that, and they say that's not worth following through my duties, because my duties in the US are to the Constitution, not just to the president. And so you want them to respect the kind of apolitical nature of the military and not actually politicize it. But in terms of how defections work, once again, just the idea that if the leader thinks that he or she can't trust their military, and if they order a mass killing, then either defection is likely or possibly a coup, then that is what's preventing them from both trying it in the first place, and if they order it and you have defections or a possible coup, then it's not going to be followed through. They really just ultimately deter the regime from possibly doing it in the first place.
Well, I think one of your questions, too, was related to whether there were alternative ways for the regime to commit atrocities, even if the sort of regular military didn't. Certainly see that in different cases and different types of counterinsurgency contexts. But Evan and I did do versions of the model where we used the existence of pro-government militias to see if that actually increased the effect or the likelihood at all, and it actually didn't. We were surprised to find that because we thought that might be catching some of these cases where there might have been atrocities against nonviolent resistance campaigns, but it didn't have the impact we expected. In terms of the question about Syria, I am sort of one of the people that thinks that actually the internationalization of that particular campaign fairly early on did predispose civilians to higher levels of violence. And that, of course, there was a sort of reaction to that with calls for immediate need for armed self-defense, and that then carries forward into dynamics that honestly the dissidents couldn't control. And then regional actors were coming in on the opposition side, Russia and Iran coming in on the side of the government. I think that it really did undercut what progress nonviolent resistance was having in terms of expanding space in the country for potential concessions and such at the time. And then with regard to this question of campaign goals, it's a tough one, Maciej, because I wouldn't be comfortable on the basis of our data giving advice to activists in terms of moderating their goals, because our finding is based on the categories of campaigns that we look at more than whether they shifted into arguing from one type of goal to another. And the data are necessarily limited to the types of campaigns that we looked at. That is, what I'm saying is we didn't compare them against different types of goals where you could imagine they shifted from calling for economic reform into regime change or something like that. Like we didn't look at that type of dynamic, so I wouldn't really be comfortable speculating at this point about that, but I do think it could be something that once data like that are available could be very important to understand. And it's related to Eli's first question too about just like, what is the discourse, like what is actually being said and called for? And in our data, we don't really look at communication strategies or kind of discourses as a qualitative matter, but my sense is that there is plenty of literature out there on the fact that rhetoric often kind of prefigures what's allowable for us to do to other people, and that we could sort of safely say that the more you dehumanize the person you're talking about, the more likely it is that your mind doesn't catch you with moral inhibitions when opportunities come to treat them as subhuman. And so to the extent that campaigns of nonviolent resistance have been remembered and recorded in history as novel and important in our time, I think it's precisely because they often are also qualitatively oriented in a way that doesn't fall into that trap of dehumanizing the other side. That said, there are some campaigns that I would totally characterize as nonviolent campaigns in terms of their methods that I wouldn't necessarily say were staying on the side of not trying to dehumanize the opponent. And so it's sort of an open question, I think, empirically, as to what real traction for kind of radical change that can have in a society in ways that would be nonviolent in the longer term.
Just a quick intervention about the goals of the campaign. In fact, Jonathan Pickney, in his monograph published by ICNC on breaking and making nonviolent discipline, which in fact you can download for free from ICNC website, he looked into the likelihood of movements basically not being able to maintain nonviolent discipline vis-a-vis their goals. And his data showed that the more revolutionary goals of the campaign vis-a-vis more reformist goals, they have greater chances of leading those campaigns into the situation that it will be much more difficult for them to maintain nonviolent discipline, perhaps increasing the repression on the part of the government, and also maybe polarizing some of the members of the movement who might not necessarily support those revolutionary goals. But that was on the level of maintaining a nonviolent discipline. So certainly more research on that would be great. We've got still a couple of minutes, and I would like to maybe 2 or 3 more questions from the audience. Here.
Hi, thank you. So my name is CJ Pine, and I'm a contractor at the State Department. And I'm just curious for this third recommendation, could you help me contextualize a little bit? At face value, it seems pretty groundbreaking, and it seems, and Victoria, I'd be interested to hear your perspective on somewhat contrary to what U.S. government policy often is to provide support in some way. And I know that you've mentioned that there's ongoing research, and would love to follow up and learn more about that. But at this point, similar to what you just said about given the level of data and what recommendations you would give, what further recommendations would you give based on that point?
Can you say the point?
The third, foreign states should avoid visible material support.
Okay, yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm Arlo, I'm Brandeis student. I want you to comment on the foreign intervention. It's been discussed a lot here. But countries have their vested interest, and sometimes countries can push forward, but the interest might be different from the resistance or from non-violence movement that are engaged. And in practice also we see that it has been weakening the push that is coming from the people. And sometimes, countries can have different interests on different issues, like the Syrian case. So people might be fighting for the issue, but different countries can weaken the non-violence movement. I want you to comment on that one. How do you see on your report that foreign states should avoid visibility, but countries might be also differently engaged and weaken the national pressure which is coming from the...
Perfect. And then there was one more. Yeah, whoever would want to address that question, if you can repeat that for others. And there's a hand in the last row.
Michael Beer with Nonviolence International. Thank you very much for this research. It's terrific. I'm wondering about 2 variables. One is social distance, whether foreigners or language differences can be a factor in mass killings, and the stage of a conflict or the duration of a conflict, whether there's certain stages, let's say, in a conflict where we might see more mass killings than others.
Perfect. Okay, and I would also ask discussants to identify a key takeaway from the report for your job that either you are right now doing or you are thinking about doing in the future, and how that report might in fact, or the findings might in fact be helpful for your work as a kind of concluding part for our discussion. So Erika, Evan, if you address that, please go ahead.
Sure. So TJ, your question about avoiding, it's controversial to avoid support. I'll let others who have more experience in the government talk to that point. But I think, and this really gets to the question about foreign intervention and how the foreign interveners might have different interests. I think you often see this, and this really comes out more in the literature on civil wars rather than nonviolent resistance. But foreign interveners often have very different interests that push the conflict in a very different direction, often for the worse. So I think the literature would suggest that in violent conflicts where you have foreign intervention, typically they last longer, they have more fatalities. It really usually is not a very good thing for those on the ground in the actual conflict. And most of those insights come from violent conflicts, which I tend to have studied previously much more, so I know more about. But I think there you can see a lot of the negative externalities associated with foreign intervention. And then many of these might be similar, but also there might be a host of different reasons why you want to kind of stay out of nonviolent movements and uprisings as well. Because once again, it just makes it seem like someone else is maybe pushing their own agenda, and you maybe can't trust that this is a grassroots uprising. And yeah, I think about the question for social distance for Michael and the stage and duration of the conflict. That's a great point. And I think in the actual paper underlying this report, we do have a variable that measures how long the conflict has been going on. I don't think we found any significant effects from that. But once again, stemming from the literature on violent uprisings, when you can create a very strong other of your adversary, and whether that's created by ethnic differences, religious and ideological differences, that often does lead to more entrenched conflict. So you're absolutely right that there could be something there to whether or not there is an ideological, social, or ethnic dimension to the uprising might have an effect as well. But we didn't capture that in the current project, but there absolutely is literature to suggest that would play a role.
In terms of this item 3 issue, foreign states should avoid visible material support. So what this looks like functionally is if there's an ongoing movement somewhere, the reason that nonviolent movements win is never because they have more money than their adversary. It's almost never because they have better organization than their adversary. It's almost always because they have more actual widespread popular participation, support, and legitimacy than their adversary. So imagine you're 9 months into a campaign. You have been somebody who's new to activism, but this has been the most inspiring thing you've ever participated in because you belong to something like unique, national, and radical and transformative in your country. And then you find out that the people who have been leading your movement and training you have actually been receiving funds from a foreign government that's controversial in your country. That could really undermine your confidence, both in the judgment of the leadership, but also in your safety, right? Because all of a sudden now when the dictator gets on TV again and says, this is nothing more than a 2-bit foreign conspiracy, you know that there are more people who are likely to listen, and that in fact the security forces themselves might now be much more threatened because they view this as an international conflict, not a domestic conflict. And so they might be then more likely to shore up unity and support for the regime. You're less likely to get those defections. It makes it much more risky for you to participate. And actually you might not want to. You might not be somebody that thinks that it's a great idea to do whatever this foreign power wants this movement to do, or be used, right, as a puppet. So I think that it complicates. It's not always the kiss of death, but I think it really can be. And so to that extent, you know, if you're the United States and you say you care about like human rights promotion and so forth, you know, there's a question of whether whether interfacing with grassroots communities doing that well already with their own claims and with their own resources and political skill, would prefer that you actually interface with your counterparts in their government and deal with them directly, right? And say, wow, you're in a bind here. Obviously, you know, the United States has no opinion on your domestic politics, but, you know, how can we help you out of this bind? Are you trying to, you know, short of any kind of human rights violations, which of course the United States would not accept, you know, how can we help mediate this issue? What are the factions like in the government? You know, if the deal was kind of an interfacing with counterparts rather than a you know, flag waving and coming in to support the grassroots, which makes them totally vulnerable and assumes no risk for the United States at all whatsoever, right? That's the issue at stake. And so I think we can talk lots more about what those types of things might look like in the future. The social distance, Michael, great questions. We do have a variable in the model that's important, and that's whether there's existing discrimination against particular social, ethnic, and religious minorities. And it's a very powerful predictor, of course, of these things taking place. But it's also a major condition under which nonviolent resistance emerges in the first place, right? So it's a major source of grievance, and that can be motivating as much as it can be demobilizing. And then in terms of the question from the gentleman here about the fact that foreign powers can weaken movements, I think I've sort of addressed that to some extent here, but overall I think it's important just to recognize that, you know, nonviolent movements generally don't succeed or fail, and existing findings and mass killings don't necessarily happen against them always because of the way that foreign powers are kind of meddling at the outset. Like nonviolent resistance can't be exported or imported. It's something that happens domestically by definition. But it certainly is the case that the actions and sort of blunders of international actors can really undermine the conditions for those movements to succeed in their own right. And so I think it is something for us to explore further with the best data and research we can find, and the best policy minds as well.
Great, thank you. And we are coming to the concluding part. I just want to ask for, like, briefly the key takeaway, Victoria Cascande, from the report and that discussion. All
right. I will twin it with the gentleman's question that the foreign states should avoid visible material support. In response to you, the United States has embassies around the world. So it's that we are always asked our views on what's going on. Yeah. And your line on human rights is not that high. So what I would say is that some of what happens is, in a diplomatic sense, we're always talking to governments about whether they're following their own laws, whether or not they're balancing human rights, et cetera, which twins to your question. It's not always one side or the other that's right. So I do think that could use some more exploring, because what that line is, when it tips over to being damaging in the public eye, this may be separate than the private pressures put on. So my one takeaway is we need to be more clear-eyed about why any actor commits atrocities, and have a better sense of the difference between a localized mob and state-sponsored extreme violence up to and including ethnic cleansing and genocide. And I don't think that's something yet that governments are good at distinguishing the indicators up front to help prevent an escalation to those extreme cases.
Thank you, Victoria. Conde.
Yeah, I just, before I conclude, I would also say that sometimes what the regime have after leaving the power is very strong determined on committing mass crimes or not. And this could be looking, for instance, Ethiopian president was easy to leave the power and just join the family and still stay there, while Yahya Jammeh in Gambia has to leave the country and go to be asylum in another country. But that could be even further more difficult for Bashir, who is indicted by International Criminal Court, to either leave the power. Where will it go? And it's more likely to commit mass crime, because any situation after that, there's no clear answer on that. So, on how really the nonviolent movement itself and international community sensibly navigate those kind of problems that could appear or occur within the regime facing such kind of issues and challenges. And this here comes also and international intervention without clear plan of what after. And that exactly happens in the Sudanese case of indicting the president without having a real mechanism in place to implement that kind of orders. The real takeaway for this, I would really say that, particularly in general context, but in Africa, where we have 63% of population are below 25 years old, and the population pyramid is really looks so much wider, bigger down, and very small up. Added this with a very slow economic growth of aggregate of 2.8% a year, with unemployment which is extremely high. And one thing that is more clear is that in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, even in the high employment rate that exists, in each 7 unemployed person, 5 are young people below 25. And this really shows that a very good indication that there is a more prediction for political instability in the region. And it is very difficult to say the international community and systems and even the state economy, which looks so much higher, and each country that start taking off for development, for instance, Nigeria and other countries, it really take off with very increase in inequality. It leaves many people poor and few people goes up to be more rich. And this is also an indication for political instability. Below that, the preventive actions that could be taken by international development agencies, whatever, doesn't answer the question of need of people to be part of any cause for improving their livelihood and their situation, particularly in young people. This research outcome really gives an indication that training people in having an agency and having nonviolent movement as a method of addressing that discontent gives an answer for people to find an alternative means of taking the action against your government or facing the systems without really having to go to the bush. And this particularly, I'm talking this in a countries like in the Central African, Horn Africa, where an AK-45 is cheaper than a pound of improved seed of maize. It is very easy to access gun and go to the bush. And so how really international organizations and peace building field will try to really increase and use the outcome of this research to really sort and increase more funding on building and training people for nonviolent action, but also further research could be done to contextualize the outcome. This outcome has come from very bigger research, but diving down in different contexts, we might have different outcomes. So how could really encourage to more research in different country contexts or region contexts to see the dynamics of how more successful engagement could happen and more better techniques to improve the nonviolent movement. Thank you.
Thank you, Conde. Well, I would like to thank Evan, Erica, for a great presentation, for a very insightful and important special report. I would like to thank Victoria and Conde for the feedback and comments. And I would like to thank the audience for staying with us for so long and for your comments. So thank you.